So, as you are now well aware from my introductory remarks and a little showing of this rather beautiful icon, Tuesday was St. George's Day. And given the patriotic sentiments that are quite often abroad in the nation at that time, I don't know how many of you follow social media, but there were a number of people putting up flags of St. George and saying, "Come on, Brits, fight for King George, St. George," and quoting Shakespeare, all that business of, cry Harry and God and St. George, and all that. It gets very silly. But I thought it would be interesting to explore a bit of who George was and what his life and his martyrdom might have to say for us. So let's start by asking, what do we know for a fact about St. George? Well, the answer is precious little, I'm afraid. In fact, in the year 494, Pope Gelasius I stated that George was, and I quote, "among those saints whose names are justly reverenced among men, but whose actions are known only to God." In other words, about 150 years after George had lived and died, the Pope is saying, we really don't know anything about him, but we assume he was a holy guy, so we'll commend him as a saint. Further research tells me that for every story or legend about St. George, there are 2 or 3 others that tell a very different story. But here's a reasonable summary of what we may think that we know about him. George was probably a Syrian, that is, a Syrian, but he was a Roman soldier. So he was a Syrian man in the Roman army who was living in Palestine at the beginning of the 4th century. He was martyred at the town of Lod, which is southeast of Tel Aviv in today's map, in about the year 304. So this was the time of the great persecutions of the Emperor Diocletian, under which our own St. Faith was also martyred. George became known throughout the East as the Great Martyr. Not quite sure why, but that was the title given to him by the early church. There were, in fact, churches in England dedicated to him from well before the Norman conquest. The oldest I could find goes back to the year 704, which was in Dorset. The story of him slaying a dragon, as shown so beautifully on this icon, well, it turns out it might be that people have mixed him up specifically with the Archangel Michael. Now, if you are spry enough, you might like to turn round and look at the stained glass window of St. Michael, which is to the right at the back of our church. Yeah. If you're not spry enough, you can have a look afterwards. Now, if you care to get close enough, you'll see on that picture of Michael that he is standing upon a blue dragon. Don't ask me why the dragon's blue. I think we'll put that down to artistic license. But it's a rather splendid rendering of Michael standing on the dragon. Of course, this is from literature that comes from the book of Revelation. It's the notion of Michael, the captain of all the angels, the archangel, defeating Satan in a great battle. Satan, of course, represented by the dragon. So it's possible that George and Michael have got mixed up in the public imagination because they've seen images of Michael and assumed they were George. There's also a legend about the Greek god Perseus slaying a sea dragon, a sea monster, which was a myth that was also associated with Lod. Remember the town that George came from or lived in. So it's a bit confusing, isn't it? There's lots of this mythology floating around. But let's look at the history of how he became our saint, our patron saint of this country. George is, of course, not only England's patron saint, he's also the patron saint of Ethiopia, a fact which I love to remind white supremacists about whenever they try and trot out their vile words, and they try appropriating George to their warped cause. He's also, incidentally, the patron saint of Portugal and of the Mediterranean islands of Malta and of Gozo. He is the patron saint of the Orthodox Church, whose depictions, such as this, are legendary. The famous flag of St. George, the red cross on a white background, as shown there on our altar, well, that was first conceived by the city-state of Genoa in Italy. So for me, it's quite encouraging that England has chosen as its patron saint such a multicultural saint as George. It's ironic, isn't it? Given how George is so often seen as affixed to some kind of warped English nationalism. In fact, he is the most multicultural of saints. The other major countries of the British Isles are a bit more parochial in their outlook, in their selection of their saints. Andrew was chosen for Scotland, mainly because it's believed that his bones were buried in Scotland at St. Andrews. Nobody really knows if that's true, but that's the legend, and that's why Andrew is the patron saint of Scotland. Patrick, as we explored a few weeks ago, Patrick was a Briton, but he did a fantastic job of converting the Irish to Christianity. David was a Welshman. He was born in Wales and became its great bishop. Interestingly, we used to have a patron saint who was a native of Britain, namely Edward the Confessor. Yeah? He was declared a saint. King Edward the Confessor, the last king of Wessex, who died in 1066. St. Thomas of Canterbury, patron saint of our own cathedral, was another prime candidate for a while, but they were all replaced by George, the warrior saint, who was venerated around the world and a truly international symbol. It was, in fact, only during the reign of Edward VI in 1552 that George fully ascended to the status of being England's only and official patron saint. Another irony of St. George is the extent to which he is venerated by Muslims. George features quite large in ancient Islamic texts, and he's still the subject of many prayers amongst some Muslim people. There's a lovely story of William Dalrymple, you remember the journalist, visiting the shrine of St. George in Beit Jala in the West Bank in 1995. Apparently he asked the priest at the shrine, "Do you get many Muslims coming here?" And the priest replied, "We get hundreds, almost as many as Christian pilgrims. Often when I come here, I find Muslims all over the floor, up the aisles and down." So let's review what we know. George was Syrian. He was a Roman soldier who died in Palestine or Israel, depending on your point of view. He is venerated by both Christians and Muslims. He's venerated by the Orthodox Church, who create icons such as this one. He is venerated by Ethiopia, an African nation, and across the Middle East, and by other major European powers. So, when people wonder why I proudly permit the flying of the St. George's flag on the top of this church, I tell them this: that to appropriate George as some kind of narrow English nationalist is a remarkably ignorant thing to do. It's a laughable example of an own goal. George represents one of the most multicultural saints that I can think of. He is loved and venerated across the world, from Russia to Africa, all across Europe and the Middle East, and thanks to the Portuguese, across most of South America too. He's a symbol of universal brotherhood and the battle against the dragons of our weaker human nature. You know, the dragons of our human nature that seek to corral us into little separate tribes, locked in hatred and mistrust against each other. May we all have the courage to follow such an example as St. George offers the church. Amen.